The bitter wind of December 26, 1776, cut through the tattered uniforms of the Continental Army like a blade through parchment. General George Washington stood on the banks of the Delaware River, his weathered face etched with the weight of a dying revolution. Behind him, fewer than 2,400 men huddled around flickering campfires, their feet wrapped in bloody rags, their spirits as frozen as the ice-choked river before them. The situation was beyond desperate. Just weeks earlier, the British had swept through New York, crushing American resistance with methodical precision. Lord Charles Cornwallis commanded over 8,000 seasoned troops scattered across New Jersey, while General William Howe's main force had settled into comfortable winter quarters. In New York City, the Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, and enlistments were set to expire at year's end. The revolution that had begun with such promise at Lexington and Concord seemed destined to die in the snows of New Jersey. Washington knew that without a dramatic victory, the cause would collapse entirely. The surprise attack on Trenton had provided a momentary spark, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers and boosting morale. But it was merely a reprieve. The British would respond swiftly and overwhelmingly. According to historical accounts preserved in the Library of Congress archives, Washington understood that he needed to strike again. Before Cornwallis could marshal his full strength, the general's piercing blue eyes surveyed his ragged army. These men had endured months of retreat, defeat, and despair. They had watched their comrades fall at Brooklyn Heights and seen their capital abandoned. Yet here they remained, bound not by contract or coin, but by something far more powerful, the belief that liberty was worth any sacrifice. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, barely 20 years old, but already trusted with artillery command, approached through the snow. His youthful face bore the premature lines of a man who had seen too much, or too soon. "Sir," he reported, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "our scouts report Cornwallis is massing forces at Princeton. He means to crush us between his anvil and Trenton's hammer." Washington nodded grimly. The British strategy was sound drive. The Americans back against the Delaware and destroy them utterly. But the American commander had learned much from his defeats. Speed, surprise, and audacity might yet turn the tide. Where conventional tactics had failed, Thomas Paine's words from the crisis echoed in Washington's mind. These are the times that try men's souls. Indeed, they were about to be tried as never before. The general made his decision with the cold calculation of a chess master. If Cornwallis wanted to spring a trap, Washington would spring one of his own. As darkness fell over the frozen landscape, Washington gathered his officers around a makeshift table illuminated by flickering candles. The plan, he outlined, was audacious to the point of madness. A night march through enemy territory, followed by a dawn assault on Princeton. Success would require perfect timing, absolute silence, and more luck than any mortal man deserved. The fate of a nation hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of a knife wielded by farmers and merchants who dared call themselves soldiers. January 2nd, 1777, began with deception worthy of the greatest military minds in history. As Cornwallis prepared his assault on Trenton, expecting to find Washington's army trapped like rats in a barrel, the American commander executed a maneuver that would be studied in military academies for centuries to come. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the Continental Army began its silent exodus from Trenton. Washington had ordered the campfires kept burning and assigned a small detachment to make noise throughout the night, creating the illusion that his entire force remained in position. Meanwhile, the main body crept along the Quaker Road toward Princeton, their wheels wrapped in cloth, their voices reduced to whispers. Captain John Marshall, future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but then a young infantry officer, later described the march as the most harrowing night of my military service. The temperature had plummeted below freezing, and many soldiers left bloody footprints in the snow. Yet not a man complained, understanding that their silence meant the difference between victory and annihilation. The route Washington chose demonstrated his growing mastery of unconventional warfare. Rather than taking the direct King's Highway, where British patrols might discover them, he led his men along back roads known only to local farmers who had joined the Patriot cause. These guides, men like Thomas Olden and Jacob Heyer, risked their lives and property to lead the Americans through the darkness, as documented in the Revolutionary War pension records, maintained by the National Archives. Sergeant Joseph Whiteoff, the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment, recorded the challenges of the march, the artillery wheels. Despite our efforts to muffle them, seemed to echo like thunder in the still night air. Every snap of a twig, every cough from a sick soldier, threatened to betray our position. The army moved in 3 columns, a formation that allowed for rapid deployment once they reached Princeton. General Nathaniel Greene commanded the left wing, consisting of Virginia and Pennsylvania troops who had proven their mettle in previous engagements. General John Sullivan led the right wing, composed primarily of New England regiments whose familiarity with winter warfare proved invaluable. During the grueling march, Washington himself rode with the center column, accompanied by his artillery under Hamilton's command. The young colonel had performed magnificently at Trenton, and Washington needed every cannon available for what was to come. The 18 pieces of artillery represented nearly half the Continental Army's mobile firepower, making their safe passage crucial to the mission's success. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the winter clouds, advance scouts reported that Princeton lay just 2 miles ahead. The British garrison, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, numbered approximately 1,200 men. Formidable odds, but not insurmountable if surprise could be achieved. Washington called a brief halt to reorganize his columns. For battle, the men fixed bayonets with hands numb from cold, their faces set with grim determination. They had marched through hell itself to reach this moment, and now they would discover whether their sacrifice would purchase victory or merely a more glorious defeat. The general surveyed his army one final time before giving the order to advance. These men had followed him through disaster after disaster, trusting in his leadership when all rational hope had fled. Now, as the spires of Princeton College emerged from the morning mist, Washington prepared to justify that faith or die in the attempt. The morning of January 3rd, 1777, broke clear and cold over Princeton, New Jersey. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood of the 40th Foot had risen early, intending to march his forces toward Trenton to support Cornwallis's anticipated victory over the trapped Americans. As he prepared his troops for departure, he had no inkling that Washington's entire army was approaching through the woods. Barely a mile away, the first shots rang out at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning near the Quaker Meeting House, where Captain Charles Scott's Virginia Light Horse encountered British foragers. The sharp crack of muskets shattered the winter stillness, and within moments, the carefully laid plans of both armies began to unravel in the chaos of unexpected combat. Washington, riding forward to assess the situation, found his advance units engaged with a British force moving along the King's Highway. Through his spyglass, he could see Mawhood's red-coated regulars forming into battle lines with the mechanical precision that had made the British Army the terror of Europe. These were not hired Hessians caught by surprise in their quarters, but veteran British soldiers alert and ready for battle. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the American vanguard, deployed his men in an orchard overlooking the main road. The Princeton-educated physician turned soldier understood the tactical situation immediately. His small force faced superior numbers in open ground. Yet Mercer, whose Scottish birth still colored his English after decades in America, prepared to hold his position at any cost. The British advance was methodical and terrifying. Mawhood's men moved forward in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming in the morning sun, their red uniforms a stark contrast against the snow-covered landscape. As recorded in the memoirs of Lieutenant Martin Hunter of the 5th to 2nd Light Infantry, preserved in the British Army Museum archives, the British soldiers advanced with the confidence born of 100 victories against irregular forces. When the two forces clashed in Thomas Clark's orchard, the fighting was savage and personal. Mercer's men, mostly Pennsylvania militia with limited training, initially held their ground through sheer determination. They fired devastating volleys into the approaching British ranks, and for a moment, it seemed as though the Americans might repel the attack through superior marksmanship alone. But British discipline prevailed. As the militia paused to reload, Mawhood ordered a bayonet charge that broke the American line like glass. The militia scattered in panic, many having never faced cold steel in battle before. General Mercer, attempting to rally his fleeing men, was surrounded by British soldiers who mistook him for Washington due to his gray hair and commanding presence. The British soldiers clubbed Mercer to the ground with their musket butts and repeatedly bayoneted him, leaving the general mortally wounded in the blood-stained snow. His aide-de-camp, Captain John Fleming, later described the brutal assault. They gave him no quarter, striking him down like a mad dog. Though he wore the uniform of a general officer, the collapse of Mercer's command threatened to turn the entire battle into a rout before it had properly begun. Raw militia units, seeing the regulars retreat, began to break ranks despite the shouted commands of their officers. The fate of the revolution seemed to hang once again by the thinnest of threads. It was at this crucial moment that George Washington demonstrated why he would be remembered as one of history's great military leaders. Spurring his white charger forward, he rode directly into the midst of the fleeing soldiers, his voice carrying over the chaos of battle like a clarion call to courage. The sight of their commander-in-chief riding fearlessly into the teeth of battle transformed the American retreat into something approaching military order. Washington's white horse, conspicuous against the winter landscape, became a rallying point for soldiers who had momentarily lost their nerve. His calm voice, carrying clearly over the musket fire, began to restore discipline to what had threatened to become a complete rout. "Form up, men," Washington commanded, his sword raised high above his head. "Show them what free Americans can do." The general's presence seemed to electrify the retreating soldiers, who began to coalesce around their officers despite the British advance continuing to press forward with methodical determination. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding the artillery battery assigned to the center column, had been waiting for precisely this moment. The young officer, whose mathematical precision had already earned Washington's respect, deployed his cannons with the efficiency of a clockmaker. His guns, loaded with grape shot, awaited the order to unleash devastation upon the advancing British ranks. The tactical situation remained precarious. Mahood's regulars, emboldened by their success against Mercer's brigade, continued their advance toward the main American position. The British commander, a veteran of campaigns in the Caribbean and Europe, recognized that momentum was crucial in battle. If he could break Washington Center before American reinforcements arrived, the day would belong to King George. Colonel John Cadwalader, leading Philadelphia militia who had missed the attack on Trenton due to ice conditions, now had his chance to prove his men's worth. These were merchants, artisans, and clerks who had drilled in the squares of Philadelphia, but had never faced British regulars in open battle. Their resolve would be tested in the crucible of combat against some of Europe's finest soldiers. Washington positioned himself where the danger was greatest, directly between his forming battle line and the advancing British. According to eyewitness accounts preserved in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the general's aide-de-camp, Colonel Robert Harrison, later recalled, "His Excellency rode along our front, within 30 yards of the enemy, calling upon the men to advance and promising them victory if they would but stand firm." The British, supremely confident after breaking the first American line, marched forward with the mechanical precision that had won them battles from Minden to Quebec. Their muskets were loaded, their bayonets fixed, and their officers calling out the cadence of their advance. Victory seemed certain to men who had defeated French regulars and now faced what they perceived as colonial rabble. At the crucial moment, Washington gave the order that would be remembered as long as men studied military courage. "Advance and charge," he commanded, spurring his horse forward directly toward the British line. The general's personal courage, displayed so dramatically at such a critical moment, galvanized his entire army. Hamilton's artillery roared to life, sending deadly grape shot tearing through the British ranks. The perfectly ordered red lines suddenly wavered as soldiers fell by the dozens. Simultaneously, American infantry, their confidence restored by Washington's example, advanced with fixed bayonets, their battle cry of liberty or death echoing across the battlefield. The British, caught off guard by the sudden American aggression, began to waver. These same soldiers who had advanced so confidently moments before now found themselves facing determined opponents who seemed willing to die rather than retreat. Mahood, recognizing that the tactical situation had shifted dramatically, began to consider withdrawal. The moment of crisis had passed. Washington's personal courage, combined with Hamilton's artillery precision and the determination of soldiers who had found their fighting spirit, had transformed near defeat into the possibility of victory. The outcome of the battle, and perhaps the war itself, now hung in the balance as the armies clashed in the winter morning light. The transformation of the American army in those crucial minutes defied every convention of 18th century warfare. Soldiers who had been in full retreat moments before now pressed forward with bayonets leveled, their faces set with grim determination. Washington's personal example had accomplished what months of drilling and discipline had failed. To achieve it, had forged these farmers and merchants into a fighting force worthy of their cause. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, observing the sudden change in American behavior from his position near the Princeton road, felt the first stirrings of doubt. These were not the same colonials who had fled in panic at Brooklyn Heights or abandoned Philadelphia without a fight. Something fundamental had changed in the character of the Continental Army, and that change was now manifesting itself in deadly earnest. The British 17th Light Dragoons, positioned on Mahood's left flank, found themselves under intense pressure from Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's Rhode Island Regiment. These New Englanders, veterans of the grueling retreat across New Jersey, had scores to settle with their pursuers. They advanced with the methodical determination of men who had been tested in the fire of defeat and emerged stronger for the experience. Hamilton's artillery continued to rake the British lines with devastating effectiveness. The young colonel had positioned his guns to create interlocking fields of fire, a tactical innovation that maximized the destruction his limited number of cannons could inflict. Each blast sent clusters of grape shot tearing through the red-coated ranks, creating gaps that American infantry immediately rushed to exploit. The fighting around Nassau Hall, the main building of the College of New Jersey, became particularly fierce. British soldiers had taken refuge in the stone structure, using its windows as firing ports to command the surrounding area. Captain Alexander Hamilton, recognizing the tactical importance of the building, personally sighted one of his cannons and sent a 6-pound ball crashing through the building's walls, forcing the defenders to abandon their position. According to military dispatches preserved in the George Washington papers, at the Library of Congress, the general himself described the moment when British resistance began to crumble. The enemy, finding themselves pressed on all sides and unable to maintain their position against our determined advance, began to give ground in disorder. The psychological impact of the American success proved as important as the tactical victory. British soldiers, accustomed to facing opponents who broke and ran at the first sign of superior force, now found themselves confronting men who seemed willing to die rather than yield. This reversal of expectations created a crisis of confidence that spread through the British ranks like wildfire. Mahood, recognizing that his position had become untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward the Millstone River. The British commander conducted this retreat with the professional skill that had made him a respected officer, but he could not disguise the fact that his force was in full retreat before an enemy they had been sent to destroy. The pursuit that followed demonstrated how much the Continental Army had learned from its early disasters. Instead of allowing the British to withdraw in good order, American light infantry harassed the retreating enemy at every opportunity. Captain Thomas Rodney of the Delaware Militia described the chase. Our men pursued them like hounds, giving them no rest and capturing many who fell behind from exhaustion or wounds. The capture of Princeton represented more than a tactical victory. It was a symbolic triumph that resonated throughout the colonies. The college town, with its brick buildings and tree-lined streets, had been a center of British administrative power in New Jersey. Its liberation demonstrated that no British position, however well defended, was secure from American attack. As the last British soldiers disappeared toward New Brunswick, Washington surveyed the battlefield with satisfaction. His gamble had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. The army that had seemed on the verge of dissolution just days before had proven itself capable of defeating British regulars in open battle. The general knew, however, that this victory was only the beginning of a longer struggle. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Princeton revealed the true magnitude of Washington's achievement. As British soldiers fled toward New Brunswick, abandoning their wounded and much of their equipment, the Continental Army found itself in possession of a prize far greater than a simple tactical victory. They had captured something infinitely more valuable, proof that American soldiers could defeat British regulars in conventional battle. The casualty figures told the story of a complete American triumph. British losses exceeded 100 killed and wounded, with nearly 300 taken prisoner, including a significant number of officers. American casualties numbered fewer than 40, with the tragic loss of General Hugh Mercer representing the greatest blow to Patriot morale. The Princeton-educated physician died 9 days after the battle, his body bearing 7 bayonet wounds received. While attempting to rally his fleeing men, Washington ordered his army to occupy Princeton, but he knew this position could not be held for long. Lord Cornwallis, discovering that he had been outwitted by his American counterpart, was already marching his superior force back from Trenton. The British general's rage at being deceived was masked only by his determination to destroy the Continental Army before it could escape again. The strategic implications of the victory became apparent within hours of the battle's conclusion. Throughout New Jersey, British outposts that had seemed secure in their dominance suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Garrisons at New Brunswick, Elizabethtown, and other towns began consolidating their forces, abandoning advanced positions that could no longer be defended with confidence. Colonel Hamilton, whose artillery had played such a crucial role in the victory, wrote to his friend John Lawrence describing the transformation he witnessed in the Continental Army. The men who fought at Princeton bore little resemblance to the dispirited rabble who had fled across New Jersey just weeks before. Victory has a way of teaching soldiers that they are indeed soldiers. The political ramifications extended far beyond New Jersey's borders. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress who had fled the capital began to reconsider their hasty departure. News of the victory reached them within days, carried by express riders who spread the tale of Washington's triumph throughout the colonies. According to records maintained by the American Philosophical Society, Delegate John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "The victories at Trenton and Princeton have given us new life. The British are not invincible after all." European observers, particularly French officials who had been monitoring American resistance with growing interest, took careful note of the Continental Army's success. The Marquis de Lafayette, then a young nobleman seeking military glory, later wrote that news of Princeton convinced him that the American cause deserved French support. The battle thus played a crucial role in the diplomatic developments that would eventually bring France into the war as America's ally. Washington recognized that the immediate strategic situation demanded continued movement. Cornwallis commanded over 8,000 troops and was approaching Princeton with the clear intention of bringing the Continental Army to decisive battle. The American commander had no desire to face such overwhelming odds in a conventional engagement, particularly when his recent victories had been achieved through maneuver and surprise. The decision to withdraw to Morristown represented a masterpiece of strategic thinking. The hills of northern New Jersey offered excellent defensive positions while remaining close enough to British supply lines to permit continued harassment of enemy forces. Most importantly, the region's rough terrain would neutralize British advantages in cavalry and artillery, while providing numerous routes of escape if retreat became necessary. As the Continental Army prepared to abandon Princeton, Washington took a moment to survey the battlefield where his men had proven themselves. The snow was stained with British blood, and abandoned equipment lay scattered across the frozen ground. More importantly, the faces of his soldiers bore expressions of confidence that had been absent since the dark days following the fall of New York. The transformation was complete. An army that had been written off as finished had demonstrated that it could strike, when and where it chose, defeating the finest soldiers Europe could produce. The march to Morristown marked the conclusion of what historians would later call the 10 days that shook the world. In the span of a week and a half, George Washington had transformed the Continental Army from a collection of defeated fugitives into a force capable of challenging British supremacy in North America. The Battle of Princeton, following so closely after the triumph at Trenton, sent shockwaves throughout the British Empire and beyond. Lord Cornwallis, arriving at Princeton to find only empty buildings and abandoned British equipment, experienced the full magnitude of his strategic defeat. The British general, who had confidently predicted the imminent collapse of American resistance, now faced the humiliating reality that his opponent had consistently outmaneuvered him. His dispatches to General Howe in New York revealed the extent of British demoralization. "The rebels have shown a capacity for military operations that we had not previously credited them with possessing." The retreat to Morristown proved as strategically brilliant as the battles that preceded it. Washington positioned his army in the Watchung Mountains, where rough terrain provided natural defenses, while keeping his forces within striking distance of British supply lines. From this secure base, American raiding parties could emerge to attack isolated British posts, capture supply wagons, and generally make life miserable for enemy forces scattered across New Jersey. The psychological impact of Princeton reverberated throughout the colonial population. Farmers who had hidden their grain from British foragers now openly supplied the Continental Army. Militiamen who had returned to their homes in despair after earlier defeats began to rejoin their units, bringing fresh recruits with them. The revolution, which had seemed moribund just days before, suddenly pulsed with renewed life. Recruitment, which had been Washington's most pressing concern before Trenton, now became considerably easier. Young men who had watched British and Hessian soldiers occupy their towns with apparent impunity now saw proof that these invaders could be defeated. Enlistments increased dramatically throughout the winter and spring of 1777, providing Washington with the manpower necessary to continue his campaign. The Battle of Princeton also marked a crucial evolution in American military thinking. Washington and his officers had learned to combine European tactical methods with New World innovations, creating a hybrid form of warfare that maximized American advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. This synthesis of conventional and guerrilla tactics would characterize American military operations. For the remainder of the war, international recognition of American military competence, demonstrated so dramatically at Princeton, played a crucial role in securing foreign assistance. French military advisors, who had been skeptical of American capabilities, began to view the Continental Army as a force worthy of support. The diplomatic negotiations that would eventually result in the Franco-American alliance of 1778 can be traced directly to the confidence inspired by Washington's winter victories. The British response to Princeton revealed the extent to which the battle had altered strategic calculations on both sides. General Howe, previously confident that the rebellion could be crushed through conventional military operations, now recognized that he faced a protracted guerrilla war that might last for years. British strategy shifted from seeking decisive battle to controlling key population centers, a defensive approach that ceded initiative to the Americans. As winter deepened around Morristown, Washington reflected on the transformation his army had undergone. The men who had crossed the Delaware in desperation had become soldiers in the truest sense of the word. They had faced British regulars in open battle and emerged victorious, proving to themselves and the world that American independence was more than a political slogan, it was a military possibility. The Battle of Princeton thus stands as one of the decisive engagements of the Revolutionary War, not because it destroyed British military power, but because it demonstrated that such power could be challenged and defeated in the space of a few hours. On a cold January morning, Washington had saved the Revolution and set it on the path to ultimate victory. The farmers and merchants who fought in Thomas Clark's orchard had proven themselves worthy of the liberty they claimed, and in doing so, had changed the course of history itself. The echoes of Princeton would resonate for years to come, inspiring Americans through the dark days at Valley Forge and the long campaigns that followed, until finally, at Yorktown, British resistance collapsed entirely and American independence became reality.